Today, I have with me Todd Stewart. Todd, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to do some dungeon talking, where we talk about, I want to talk about Dungeon Master stuff, and I want to pick Todd's brain, because Todd is a Planescape expert. I guess he's definitely like the Shemeshka expert, probably in the world, I think.
And, I've kind of hijacked the character's name as an online persona for God, like over a decade, and I've written some of the published stuff on the character. So,
and Todd, you've also made a lot of RPG products, right?
Yeah, pretty hefty amount.
Did a lot of Pathfinder, right?
Yeah, Pathfinder has been what I've primarily been writing since it started. Like this past year, I worked on 3 hardcovers: Bestiary 6, Book of the Damned, and the forthcoming Planar Adventures, which I'm really, really looking forward to seeing out.
Really? So, Planar Adventures? I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they announced that one at Gen Con.
Oh, okay. That's really cool. So, all right, where do we start here? All right, so as far as Shemeshka goes, a lot of the viewers who watch Dice Camera Action know who Shemeshka is. Shemeshka is an NPC who lives... Hey, do you say sigil or sigil?
Sigil.
You say sigil. Oh God, I can't.
If you say sigil, you get tossed over the edge.
Oh no, I can't. I hate it. It makes me want to. I would get tossed over the edge. That's right. I have an image of Shemeshka here. All right, so Shemeshka, boom. That was a commissioned piece of art, right, by Cassette Recorder. So Shemeshka is. Well, you tell people who Shemeshka is, please.
Shemeshka is an Arcanoloth. They are basically fox or jackal-headed humanoids. They are a type of fiend known as a Yugoloth, who are neutral evil. And depending on the sources that you look at, Yugoloths are either, just base, avaricious mercenaries who will do anything for money, and they're heavily involved in the Blood War. If you look at other sources, they're actually the oldest of the fiends. They created the other fiend races. They manipulate the Blood War like immortal puppet masters. And all they truly want is a perfect universe. If I can paraphrase what Colin McComb wrote in Second Ed's Faces of Evil, the Fiends, it's just a glorious opening chapter talking about what Yugoloths are. And it says more or less that they want a perfect multiverse. And in their view, a perfect multiverse is one in which mercy has no conceptual basis. So these are not pleasant creatures. They are absolutely backstabbing. They are lies incarnate. And I think for a lot of reasons, Shemeshka has become kind of the poster child of what Arcanoloths actually are. To a lesser extent, I think her possibly counterpart, Aiken, the Friendly Fiend in Sigil, is also a bit of a poster child for their kind. And I think that they're really popular as far as fiends go, and I think it's because anytime that they've been put down in print, they've always been just glorious jackasses of characters. They're talkative, and they're the most human of the fiends, for lack of a better way of saying it, that you're going to find. You can really get inside their heads and easily see just what sort of conniving, hideous things they are. But yeah, it really worked for me when I started running, just to have, these very, very talkative, loquacious creatures, but at the same time, they're not just there for money. They're not just there for buying and selling secrets. And although they can be absolutely petty schmucks, they're probably the most wicked creatures in existence. And occasionally I'd pull that out of my ass and show that, where the public facade of one of these creatures drops and you just see this horrific sociopathic monster. And that pops up in the story hour that I write, pretty occasionally, including most recently in some of the recent updates there. But just really, really great NPCs. I think we can thank Ray Valise for creating her back in Second Ed. So
now I think one of her first appearances was in Uncaged Faces of Seagull. I'll say Seagull. Oh,
yep.
And there was a thing in here. I love this little factoid.
It's a great book.
She's called King of the Cross Trade, right?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because for several reasons. In game, it's because you can't really be Queen of Sigil because the Lady of Pain is this presumably, ostensibly female figure that is in control of everything in Sigil. Although, of course, her nature is an entirely different thing. And so nobody really wants to call themselves Queen of the City. Shemeshka also may simply feel that, for whatever reason, King sounds more imposing. Based on the dynamics of a lot of humanoid societies. She might just be playing that up.
What's the other one?
Also, the other reason is because there was a typo. And for gender, they put a male symbol for her.
Uh-huh.
Now, it gets more complicated than that. And Ray Valise, who created her, has straight out said, if you want to play her as actually being transgender, feel free. If you want to do that, go right for it. At the same time, if you read deeper in Planescape's Faces of Evil, the Fiends, all of the Yugoloths are actually explicitly described as being dual-gendered. So it kind of puts that all into question. But at the same time, Arcanoloths, as a subtype of Yugoloth, have shapeshift at will. At least they did in Second and Third Ed. So it kind of becomes a case of they're pretty much whatever they want to be at the moment. So if they've picked a particular gender, they're prone to stick with it, I suppose, just for ease of communicating with mortals. But really, and I think Perkins said this, that she's more a thing than describing her, as a woman. But for the most part, she is what she wants to be. And she has the wealth and power to really do whatever the hell she wants.
Now, does that mean you said all Yugoloths? So that includes like the Mesoloths, the insect guys?
Yep.
They're both too? Yeah.
At least that's what it is in Second Ed. And it hasn't really been explored to the same degree that book did, and that no other book before or since in D&D history has covered fiends to the same degree of ecological and societal exploration as Faces of Evil did. It is a genuinely spectacular book. Yeah. I wish I had written part of it. It's that damn good.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, all of the Loths are described as explicitly hermaphroditic, using the book's words.
Now you wrote. I love that. She's like that's a historic character to me. So in my game, I run her, just like that. And how do you in the books they have this like vague relationship between Shemeshka and Akin or whatever, Akin, the friendly fiend. Like, how do you run them?
Without spoiling any of the future plot from my story hour, anytime I use the two of them in a game, I try to make it as absolutely nebulous as I possibly can. She'll fly into a rage if you simply mention him. She'll occasionally firebomb his shop. She'll talk all kinds of crap about him. And he'll kind of take the higher road and not want to talk about it and not wanting to get into his past or what exactly the relationship is. But I have rumors fly, and they're often hideously contradictory. Um, the players in one of my games actually started a rumor that the two of them were in a relationship, and every night she would end up going to his place and he would smack the snot out of her. And in the words of one of the players, she liked it. And it became a joke for them.
Okay.
Mostly because they absolutely despised her. Her blackmailing all of them into getting themselves hurled into a maze was the first plot arc of my home campaign. So understandably, they did not like her. It got really, really bad. Eventually, she ended up making multiple attempts to kill one of the PCs, and it just went from there.
That's awesome. Yeah, I run them like they're frenemies, you know, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
There was a note. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's a note in one of the books that says that sometimes if you pass, Akin has a magic shop, right?
Yeah.
And so
the friendly fiend.
I think he lives up above it. And supposedly sometimes when you walk by at night, you'll hear him screaming and like trashing his own apartment. And as far as I know, it was never explained why. But I love, so once in a while, my group has passed that place a few times, and I've had that happen, and they get real weirded out by it, and they try to check it out, but they haven't.
Yeah, one of the explanations was that it's him taking out his absolute rage and frustration from having to smile and be nice with people while he's running his shop, and using that persona to extract information from people who don't necessarily realize that they're talking to him like a friend. Of course, my players were like, oh, that's not him screaming and trashing the place. That's the two of them smacking each other around.
That's funny. I like that. I'm going to use that. All right, so I have always, as a kid, I never understood Yugoloths. When I was a kid, I had a really hard time understanding demons, devils, Yugoloths. You know what I mean? Like, demons are chaos, devils are law, and Yugoloths are neutral evil. And I could never wrap my head around that. So sometimes sometimes they'll just throw a monster in there. They don't say what it is. Well, also you had to know what a Tanari and a Batezu was. And as a kid, I couldn't keep it all sorted out. So Yugoloths to me were like, I don't even want to touch them because I can't even figure out demons and devils. And it was too complicated to me. Like in the Hellbound, the Blood War box set, a lot of that is about Yugoloths, you know, and that giant thing. I don't want to spoil it, but like, and like I was always out. Oh, and then there was a Ravenloft adventure, I think, which involves Yugoloths, right? With the Book of Keeping or something.
Yeah, with Inajira.
Yeah, what was that?
Inajira was an Arcanoloth who had made a bargain with Strahd. I'm not as familiar with that, and they may have gone different directions with some of the subsequent material on Ravenloft. I've never actually played a game in Ravenloft outside of a convention game where we ended up getting the gatehouse and sigil dumped into Ravenloft.
Wow.
So
that's crazy. How did that happen?
You would have to ask the friend of mine who ran it. And it's been over a decade now, so I really don't remember many of the details, but he's a hardcore Ravenloft fan.
What is the deal with Bearnoloths? I don't get
Again, depends on the edition. In second edition, the Bearnoloths were put forward as the original primordial fiends, the original progenitor race of all other fiends back at a very early period of the cosmos when there was only planes of law, chaos, neutral, evil, and good. And all of those hadn't actually spread out to make all of the other cardinal alignments yet by mixing.
I didn't know that.
And so the Bearnoloths...
There was a plane of good, a plane of evil, and what were the other ones?
Just the strict non-mixed alignments.
And there was
law, chaos, good, evil, and presumably neutrality.
And there was there was no prime material plane?
No. in my reading of planar prehistory, the outer planes would have come prior to the formation of the prime material.
That's awesome. You could do some cool stuff with
Now,
I would love to have my campaign like where
there was a plan at some point. I think Monty Cook said something about this years ago about having an adventure where the players get bumped back in time to some, period of planar prehistory when the planes were like that, but yet Sigil was still there.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
They never actually went, beyond some brainstorming, but that's, as I'm familiar with.
Did they give any details on like what's in the plane of good, plane of evil? Like what they have any details on?
No.
So where did the Baronelus live? Did they live in the evil plane?
Presumably the Grey Waste was the first, of the lower planes. And, whether it had 3 layers at the time or just 1 layer, who's to say? But the Baroneloths were the original progenitors. They created the Yugoloths, and then one of them kind of went mad or went rogue, named Apomps, the triple aspected, who created, again, depending on the edition, either the Garoleths or the Demodans. In either emulation of his siblings who'd created the Yugoloths, or he went off on his own and created the Garoleths first. Obviously, his kindred were unhappy about this and exiled him to Carcerai, where he still dwells in the centermost layer of Carcerai. The thing is, as described in the material, eventually the Baroneloths either faded away intentionally, or I like to think they mostly abandoned the multiverse and just left their created children adrift, still thinking that they were special, having just completely bailed. But some of them remain behind, having apparently just themselves succumbed to the spiritual wasting of the Grey Waste and just sitting there with no motivation, no care, despite their evil, not even having the energy to actually do anything, except for a group of them known as the Demented, who are described. That's their name as a group.
What is this from? Like,
this is either from Hellbound or the Planes of Conflict box set.
Oh. Okay.
And there's a group of them known as the Demented who were described as insane. Now, consider an insane Baroneloth. It's not going to be the same insanity as a mortal going mad, but these creatures have apparently a resistance to the wasting of their native plane, and they have monstrously Byzantine plots and plans, and they serve as advisors to the unique Yugoloths. And then I've gone on my own, personal canon from there.
What do the Demented look like?
One of them I've described and has been put into print, and that would be Harashek Ap Thulkesh, the Blind Clockmaker. There's some artwork that I commissioned of that particular NPC online.
Wow.
If you search for it. But I generally have each of the members of the Demented, as I've used them in my campaign, each having a unique physical ailment or disability. And
that's a cool idea.
I tend to limit their number to 13, and I've slowly been writing stories, just fleshing out each of them. I think I'm up to about 10 or 11 at this point. I just wrote one based on this one Baroneloth named the Architect, Lazarius ibn Shartalan, who I put as the creator of the Lodestones of Misery on the Grey Waste, and a couple other things. I link him to the Shadow Sorcelled Key, for instance.
Can you explain what the Shadow Sorcelled Key is? I know it's in Faction War, and I think I read it once, but I don't remember.
Yeah, it appears in Faction War, and it appears very briefly in Planescape Torment. It's a key that nobody knows the origins of, that had the ability to basically break some of the fundamental laws of Sigil, and it could force open portals. And whoever held it could simply rip open any portal to anywhere they wanted. and the key simply appears in Sigil at a very early period, several thousand years previous, and was used by natives of the Prime Material Plane who at the time were packed into a ward known as the Prime Ward. And after simply growing tired of basically being held down primarily by the Sod Killers and a couple of the other factions extant at the time, they staged a revolution of sorts. And one of them got a hold of the Shadow Sorcelled Key and attempted to use it. And things went all to hell. And apparently every single lower planar portal in what became the lower ward opened simultaneously. And fiends and pollution from the lower planes flooded into Sigil. And to an extent, that's why the atmosphere in the lower ward is such as it is, other than the Great Foundry. And it's also where the name of the ward comes from forever after, for all of the lower planar portals. Of course, the key vanishes after that point. Nobody knows who made it. Nobody knows who it's connected to, how it was able to basically break some fundamental laws of Sigil. And I ended up using that in my home campaign to suggest that it was basically a Baernoloth artifact. As for what reason they created it, that's still up in the air. But it'll end up being, you know, a pretty significant plot point as that campaign gets written down more and more fully. So maybe in 10 years you'll find out the reason.
All right. So as far I wanted to know about the Demented. You wrote.
I will say I did try to get the Shadow Sorcelled Key into print a second time. We did not manage to get it through development, however. So
Really?
it almost appeared in something, but you know, alas, that happens.
Was this 4th edition?
Rather not say.
Okay. So
generally, I'm not going to get into, you know, this product had this, but then it got cut. But
that's so mysterious. Okay. The Demented. There's 13 of them. Now you said you've been writing them up. Is this you just do that just for your own?
This is just for fun.
That's crazy.
I habitually write.
Oh.
So if I'm not writing something for publication, I'm just writing for my own edification, or, you know.
Have you ever thought about just putting it on the DMs Guild? Because the thing is, they would own.
I am very, very, very hesitant to publish anything on the DMs Guild at this point, because A, there's a 50% cut that they take, and 2, you lose all and any creative control. Basically, if I'm going to be giving up IP rights to creatures that, well, let's face it, I can't use them for myself and anything else because Baernoloth's or Wizards IP in general.
Yeah.
If I'm going to put them into print, I want to actually put them into print in a physical book rather than just a PDF. So I have no idea whether WotC would be open to publishing anything along those lines, or heck, if anybody there actually knows who I am, given that everyone that I worked with in 4th Ed is no longer at the company, and almost all of my work, you know, has been for Pathfinder for a while now. So, but, you know, Planescape is still my favorite setting. It's the setting I always keep coming back to, and I'm still writing stuff for it, just on my own time.
So do you have a campaign going right now?
No, because I am dumb and decided to go back for a PhD. So I have zero social life right now. My wife barely sees me. I come home, I eat, I study, I fall asleep, wash, rinse, and repeat. So for the next 3 years, I will not be able to have a campaign as much as I would like to.
Oh, that's brutal. When you do run a campaign, what system do you use? Like, if you were to run one right now, what would you use?
If I was to run one right now, I'd probably run it in Pathfinder, and I'd probably run a planar Pathfinder heavily influenced by Planescape campaign just because that's been heavily on my mind for the past 6 years or so. And I did run a campaign like that 5-ish years ago, ran for about a year and a half, and kind of used it to playtest a lot of stuff that ultimately started filtering into print in Pathfinder.
That's cool.
Obviously not everything, so.
Why wouldn't you run 5th? Why would you prefer to use Pathfinder?
Because I'm less familiar with it, despite having actually written something for 5th.
Oh, really?
Although it was not on the DM's Guild. I did a conversion of Pathfinder's Proteans into 5th Ed with Legendary Games.
Oh, okay, I see.
And that should be on RPG now.
I mean, because I love Pathfinder. I love their adventure paths. Like Skull and Shackles is probably my favorite, like, actual adventure path ever. That was insanely awesome, and I love a lot of their stuff. But to me, the 5th edition rules are kind of just like Pathfinder stripped down. Taking out all the.
The 5th Ed rules are a lot easier, I think, to introduce somebody to. I have heard people say that once you've introduced somebody to 5th Ed, you tend to have success moving somebody into Pathfinder, just because at this point there is a lot more published for Pathfinder, and both as a consequence of the rule set and the rule set's expectations, and for the amount of material in player support published for Pathfinder, characters are a lot more customizable. And there is a certain joy to be found in that. I don't think either rule system is necessarily better per se. It depends on both what sort of game you're looking for, what your players want, what their expectations are, and simply what you're most comfortable with. And I've been, writing Pathfinder for over a decade now, so it's easiest for me to just pull stuff on the fly for that system. But I'm absolutely not averse to playing in 5th Ed or running something in 5th Ed.
Did you ever write any of their adventure path adventures?
I have never written a published module or adventure.
Really?
With one caveat to that. I did write a module for Zombie Skies Press project, The Fairy Ring. It is in development.
Oh.
I do not know where it is. I've been paid for it. I'm very happy with it. It's taking time. I'm genuinely not sure if it will see the light of day. I wish it did, because everything else done for that project has just been spectacular. But we'll see.
Because it's weird they wouldn't ask you to do what was it called? The World Wound thing. Where
I did at the time. I did write part of the campaign setting supplement for the World Wound.
Oh, you did.
I
used a lot of that stuff in my Planescape campaign, because I think Adventure 5 is just Baphomet's Maze, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And I love Nocticula, and so I use her whenever I can. And there's Adventure 4 is like very Nocticula-y.
Yeah.
So I pulled a lot of the second half of that is all planar, and I love it. I like to read it.
Because part of it takes place in the Midnight Isles, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lamashtu, I love her too. What I like to do with Pathfinder, I raid it and use their NPCs, and I don't care if they die because they're not official D&D ones. You know what I mean? I use that as kind of like my my little toys. I just do whatever I want with, Because...
So, in a very similar capacity, when I ran my last campaign, it was set in the planar city of Galisemni in the Maelstrom. It has only appeared as a spot on a map, and it's gotten name dropped in 5 or 6 places, of which all but one are because of me. And I've been itching to get more of Galisemni detailed in print. We will see if that happens. Hint, hint, wink, nudge.
Is it in the Maelstrom, you said?
Yeah.
What is the Maelstrom? What is that?
The Maelstrom is the chaotic neutral plane in Pathfinder.
Really?
And
so it's like Limbo.
Yeah. It's Limbo, but imagine Limbo if the edges of Limbo were like a weird version of the other planes that it got near to. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets, until eventually it becomes a fully three-dimensional, semi-tangible liquid void, where things pop in and out of substance spontaneously, with serpentine proteans flitting about to and fro. Now imagine a city there. And at least in my home game, Galisemni was a bit of a case of a love letter to Sigil, without actually being Sigil. So tons upon tons of atmospheric poaching from Planescape. Honestly, I cut my teeth on Planescape as a DM, and so it really truly informs a lot of my sense of style, both in what I've written for other systems or other games since then. So, I mean, anytime I run a planar game, it'll feel like a Planescape game, regardless of what setting I'm actually using. And I think it works perfectly with Pathfinder, because part of their thing was making everything backwards compatible with 3rd Ed. Since 4th Ed was a pretty radical departure, both in terms of rules and in terms of setting content, and especially so with the planes.
Yeah. Hey, so you wrote a little bit for 4th. Did you?
I wrote a single 4th Ed project.
Did you run anything for 4th?
I did not.
No. Didn't like it, huh?
My players did not like it.
I know. Yeah, that's what I always tell. Like, I played more 4th edition than anything. I loved it, but I totally get why people wouldn't like it, because it doesn't.
There's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. Right. It had its own good ideas, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but those ideas did not seem like Dungeons and Dragons.
My friend called it.
If it had been released as its own setting, without attempting to retroactively alter what Dungeons and Dragons was, and especially impose its own unique cosmology on the other settings without really any reason why, I think it would have gone over a lot better. With all due respect to everybody who worked very hard on the stuff, I think it was just a bit too much, too quickly, for possibly some of the wrong reasons.
My friend called it D&D Tactics, and I felt like that was a very accurate description of 4th.
I can see it.
What I loved about 4th was it really was balanced. You know, because my experience with 3.5 and Pathfinder was just, the imbalance was insane. Like, if you had a group with some players who were interested in like optimization and some who weren't, you had a really weird game, because you had these people who were really powerful and you had weak people. So how do you have if a monster attacks, it's either going to get slaughtered or it's going to kill those weak people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was always like, that was why 3rd, I always had a hard time with 3rd. And the feat trees, I could never wrap my head around the feat trees, because to me the feats gave you such a little, just a tiny little thing, and you had to, I was like, what would we do?
You can always just be mean, and if a fight's going too quickly, add hit points to the creatures that are dying too quickly on the fly.
So when you run games, like, how long are your sessions?
It depends. When I first started running in college, we would start at about 10 a.m. or earlier, and run until about 7 o'clock, and then go have dinner.
Was this on the weekend?
This was every Saturday.
Oh, okay, all right, that's cool.
Now I'd say I probably would start a game at about noon, and run until we got hungry, probably about 6 o'clock. So about 5-6 hours. For any game I run. And just because of the style of games I run, if you commit to one, plan on it taking about 2 years to run to completion.
How often do you level the characters?
Whenever it seems appropriate. I don't keep track of actual XP.
So if you run,
it's more on track for plot progression and what I genuinely think the players need to be successful as they move forward. Now, my players have completely skipped over things before and taken on something while wildly unprepared for what level they are. And at one point in one of my games, They were in the astral plane, hopping from God Isle to God Isle and killing Yugoloths that were strip mining some of the dead corpses of dead deities.
Gods, yeah.
And as they go through this monstrous astral storm that these are adrift in, all centered upon the astral God Isle of the dead deity of portals, Eoskar,
yeah.
completely skewered through with very suggestively shaped blades. The players were intended to go from one hop to the next, level up in a few of these, hop to the next, and eventually make their way to the middle. Well, the players said, we go straight to the middle. So, of course, I looked down at the 20 pages of notes I have, threw them over my shoulder, and go, you know what? Okay, fine. We'll see what happens. And, of course, they end up fighting the Yugoloth overlord of Carcerai one-on-one, along with some Astroloths, as I called them, who eventually became the Astrodaemons in Pathfinder. And the trick with this critter was that she was basically astrally projecting from Carcerai, diving through a color pool to form a surrogate body that did not have a silver cord, and then plane shifting back to the astral. So basically, she's at her full power. If you kill her, she just wakes up back in Carcerai.
All right,
and can
you said
repeat.
She rules Carcerai. Who is this person?
This was a character from my home campaign called Shylara the Manged, who eventually became the Overlord of Carcerai. In print, the Overlord of Carcerai is Bubonics, and the other Altraloth named Cholerix. Shylara the Manged appears in the one thing that I wrote for 4th edition.
Yeah, I remember,
as a former apprentice and lover of Shemeshka the Marauder, who now, dwells in exile, doing her own thing, and occasionally the two of them put hits out on each other. Shylara put out a monstrous bounty on Shemeshka's head, and Shemeshka responded by putting a bounty out on her former apprentice. That was about 1/10 of the amount. Kind of rubbing in that you are a cut rate version of me.
All right, so you mentioned Eoskar. For people who might not know, Eoskar is this ancient god of portals who caused a lot of problems in Sigil. And I think, did Lady of Pain, like, just one day, all of Eoskar's cult just vanished? Is that right?
Yes, with the exception of Fel, the fallen Davos. And it was one of the Davos becoming a priest of Eoskar that was actually the catalytic point for that event. When the Temple of Eoskar was razed to the ground, and it's at least prior to Faction War, it served as the headquarters of the Aether, who used, the Temple of a Dead God as their headquarters. But during the so-called, was it the Storm of Doors? Or was it, it's been a while. In any event, the Lady of Pain either butchered or mazed all of Eoskar's clergy. It's left up in the air what happened to necessarily the lay worshippers. It's also left up in the air as to what happened to Eoskar's clergy that were actually outside of Sigil at the time. Similarly, during Faction War, you can read into it that Factal Skull of the Dustmen may have been outside of Sigil at the time he was mazed. It's not definite, but I like to leave it open that it's plausible that when push comes to shove, the Lady of Pain may actually have reach outside of the City of Doors. But I'd never actually put that in print, and I'd never come down firmly one way or the other in a campaign. Just because you never really want to define an open mystery like that if you can avoid it.
Okay, wait. I made the horrible mistake in 4th edition of making an origin for the Lady of Pain. Have you ever done anything like that? Have you ever given any clues or anything like that?
Nope.
No?
I've put little hints of the lady's influence in places where it really should not be. But I've never come out and fully explained what it actually meant. Leave that as a bit of looming question in the players' minds, and of course they'll come up with something that's probably 10 times cooler and or scarier than what you've got in mind in the first place.
Yeah.
I never actually had the lady speak in any of my campaigns, and I actually only had her show up once.
Oh, really? One time?
Yep. One time. At the end of a campaign. She showed up, was present, something happened, she turned around and drifted off.
That's it, huh? Have you ever had her, like, look at someone and they get all cut up? You ever do that?
Nope.
Really?
Nope. I've had stories of that happening.
Uh-huh.
Actually, no. I take that back. I did actually have that happen. The first plot arc of one of my home games, the players got blackmailed by Shemeshka the Marauder to go to Acheron and retrieve somebody who ended up being the former Factal Allison Nilesia of the Mercy Killers, who was being held in fiendish captivity after being sold into slavery during the faction war. Well, the players get her, they deliver her to where they're supposed to deliver her, and they're released from, their service, and they go back to Sigil. About 2 days later, a portal opens up, and Allison Nilesia, as batshit crazy as ever, appears at the head of a force of about 50 of her loyal former Mercy Killers, and she's ranting and raving about the Lady of Pain having stolen away her beloved Duke Rowan Darkwood, and she pulls out a sword, and it's a Vorpal sword, and she ends up decapitating Adabas.
Oh my god.
And the crowd just goes deathly silent, and the Lady of Pain shows up. Mm-hmm. And the Lady of Pain flays her in public, in full view of the players in my campaign.
Wow.
And then about 2 years of the campaign later, the players are in the bar that they own, and a building across the street they notice has caught on fire. Mm-hmm. One of the players runs in there and realizes that what was apparently what they thought was an empty warehouse is in fact a archive and scriptorium of the Fraternity of Order. And there's a bunch of gagged, bound, and some executed scribes. And somebody has just pulled through all of the books there looking for something in specific. And the player is looking around, and I let 3 rounds pass for an assassin's death attack to go off, and described to the player as he gets stabbed to death, as he sees the blade go through his character's chest and out the front, and somebody leans in and whispers to him that justice cannot die. And his character recognizes it from the last time that he heard Allison Nilesia. And as his character is bleeding out, he looks up and sees Allison Nilesia walking off. Except, clearly they saw her flayed alive.
That's crazy.
And I'm actually currently in the middle of that plot arc in my story hour and explaining just, what the fuck is going on with that.
We were talking before the show started, and people who might not know, Todd's been writing, he ran a campaign for 2 years, right? And
that campaign ran about 3.5.
3.5 years, and so since, you said 2005?
Since about 2005, I've been writing it up in long fiction format.
It's gigantic.
It's a couple thousand pages at this point.
I'm
still writing it. And I've got a draft for the next update sitting on my desktop that I'll probably post in another week or so.
That's awesome. So what level did that group end at?
I want to say about 23 or 24.
Oh my god. Wow.
Oh, by the end of it, they were, fighting, unique Yugoloths. So,
do you run published adventures? Like, have you run any of the Planescape adventures?
I have never run a published adventure, but I have gleefully poached elements specifically from the module Squaring the Circle and Hellbound the Blood War, where you show up in the gate town of Torch and you meet Daruib Shamik. Daruib Shamik, in my campaign, was very much not what he claimed to be in the published module. In the published module, and I quote, "I'm sorry for what I did to the Malder at Kavarik." In my campaign, oh dear God, he wasn't sorry whatsoever. And he ended up just manipulating events, both of the players in that module and behind the scenes, to basically give the Yugoloths a kick in the ass to motivate them to behave properly. And so rather than being this despondent, withered thing who's done hideous acts and actually regrets some of them, he's this horrific puppet master who's still doing the same thing that he's done since nearly the beginning of time.
You had mentioned...
I ended up...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No,
I ended up actually linking him to the only other Bernoloth who's been named in print, Harashek ap Thulkesh, the Blind Clockmaker, who likewise had a pretty big role in my home campaign.
You were talking about... All right, so you were saying the Bernoloths are ancient, right? Now, I think there's the Devils, there was the Batorians before the Devils.
The ancient Beatorians.
And then there's... The demons had the... Starts with this... Oh, doesn't it? What is it? There's Oboxob and his buddies.
The Oberiths.
The Oberiths. So, are the Bernoloths older than the Batorians and the Oberiths?
Yes. Well, granted, in second ed, it was strongly hinted that the Bernoloths created the Yugoloths, and then as a side effect of purging the Yugoloths of law and chaos, they seeded that, those fragments of law and chaos into larvae and dropped those larvae into what would become the Abyss and what would become the Nine Hells of Beator. And those then became the first Tanari and the first Beatazu. That, of course, was before the Oberiths were ever conceived of, and the ancient Beatazu were kind of their own thing. In third ed, and late in third ed, some of the stuff written in Fiendish Codex 1, which I believe was for the Abyss, or it was 2. It's been a while.
1 was the Abyss.
Whichever one Eric Mona partially wrote. They ended up very overtly putting in there that the Oberiths were actually what was created by the Yugoloths and the Bernoloths, and that presumably then the ancient Beatorians were the other side of the coin, and that the Yugoloths had their own legend that it was the current fiends that they had created rather than these precursors who hardly anybody knew ever existed. So it's better to lie and aggrandize yourself with the current state of the planes rather than what actually happened.
So running your games, what's your style like? Do you run them like? Are there a lot of combat encounters, or is it like pure just role playing?
I've been blessed with a group over the years that has primarily stayed with most of the same people over the course of about 4 campaigns. And very, very heavy RP. And the players are self-motivated and so interested in their characters and the world around them that I can literally just not say anything and they'll talk amongst themselves for an hour. And a lot of it is me as NPCs or DM just kind of nudging them in the right direction and seeing what amazing crap they come up with. More than leading them around by the nose if I possibly can. I think our longest combat drought was about 2 or 3 sessions without an actual combat showing up. And in some cases, and I'll gladly throw in situations where, yes, you can go into combat, but it will probably be a TPK if you do, because you really have no business actually getting into combat at that given point in time. I do not necessarily balance things out such that this encounter is explicitly this CR to match with the player's level, because the world around you doesn't necessarily fit into those neat boxed-in encounters. I like to have something a little bit more organic and a little bit more frightening, some might say, than something neatly and strictly planned out encounter to encounter to encounter.
That was one of the big, I think, failings of... Well, fourth, you just learned a lot. And fourth, they had orcs for first-level characters. Orcs
and it is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely a way to play.
Mm-hmm.
And to an extent, you are going to be adding class levels, onto baseline Yugoloths in a campaign. Once the characters are 20th level, I'm not going to have, a standard Ultraloth. I'm going to give, an Ultraloth like 15 Scion levels and have him, surrounded by a bunch of floating jagged metal like he's Darth Vader, which is something I actually did at one point. But yeah, my players were great. I was seriously blessed with them. They ended up writing some of their own things. One of my players now has written stuff for Eclipse Phase, which is an amazing game. If you haven't played it, you seriously should look at it. But I never used a encounter map, never used minis. Everything was theater of the mind. Although if it was a very complicated encounter, I will draw a map just to give the players an idea of what the hell's going on.
Yep.
But I tend to be a little bit more freeform about that. And if something sounds amazing and cool, I am likely to let it happen in some capacity.
Yeah, right, yeah. As a DM, what would you say your strengths are?
I really like complex plots, occasionally to a fault. I write way too much background for NPCs if I think I'm going to use them. NPCs may get a page, they may get 2 pages, they may get their past history planned out if I plan on using them a lot. And I never like to let a good/hideous NPC go to waste. They will show back up like coinage that, breaks a vending machine.
What would you say your weakness?
Even if you kill an NPC, I may bring them back at some point. And I had one character, without spoiling, my story hour, that one of the players wanted to desperately kill. And they ended up killing them, only to find out in the second campaign that was a sequel to it that they faked their own death. And in fact, were playing another character in order to fake their own death, to get the PC to conspire with them. So they eventually did get to kill them, but it took them 2 campaigns to do it.
So,
but it was worth it.
What would you say your weaknesses as a DM are?
Probably some of that same. If you don't have players that are super hyper invested, you can get bored players. If they don't want to sit and talk to an NPC waxing poetic, or if they're not super interested in history of the setting, you're going to get bored. If you don't want to go to, a party and talk to 30 NPCs that I've got wandering around, who I might have wander up and talk to you, if there's no combat plan for 3 sessions, you're going to get bored. And it comes down to not necessarily being good or bad, but just what do your players expect? If my players had not wanted to do that, I probably would have had an abortive campaign that wouldn't have probably ended. But, serendipity. What I wanted, what they wanted, ended up working.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk lately online about tactical players and story-based characters. This is kind of a thing that's been going on forever in D&D, but that's kind of the latest.
To an extent, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. I mean, yeah, there are the 2 camps broadly, but I've had players that absolutely excelled at both. And I regret giving one of them an unerrated Mercurial Greatsword from 3rd Ed.
Why?
Because that damn thing baseline had like an 18 to 20 crit range.
Oh.
And then, of course, unerrated, so keen stacks, improved crit stacks. The weapon master from 3rd ed prestige class that gave an increased crit range stacked. So they were doing hideous amounts of damage by themselves.
Now wait, when you say it stacks, does that mean the crit range
Expands.
increases? So
yeah.
What did they roll?
So,
what did they need to roll to crit?
God, they were critting on something like a 12 or higher.
Holy cow! That's crazy.
That's okay. That's okay. They learned not to think they could fight anything.
Usually, what I do when that comes up, I give
Just
a
make
bad guy.
immune to crits.
I give a bad guy the same power.
Yeah.
You know? And
Give a bad guy the same power. Throw them up against a dragon that they were not aware of what the size was before they got into combat with it.
Mm-hmm.
Alone.
Mm-hmm.
In the depths of pandemonium by themselves.
Like, to me, it's like, but the thing about that is, when someone has that kind of a character, you should definitely give them encounters where they get to do that and they can enjoy their thing, you know?
If a character has a unique shtick, I will let them use that so they get enjoyment out of it. I'm not going to give somebody something and then never allow them to use it. I am more likely to give somebody something stupidly, grotesquely overpowered in a sort of monkey's paw wish deal that you will have consequences for using this. But please take this. Please use this. Whether it's an artifact or a cursed object or some magic that, yes, it'll do whatever the hell you want it to do at a very high risk of doing, permanent ability damage to a random attribute. Yeah, pull that out when you want to, but understand there are consequences.
We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to. You had said you worked on Bestiary 6 Pathfinder, right? And that has the Pathfinder Archdevils in it, right?
Yeah.
Did you work on them at all?
I did not do the Archdevils. I worked on all of the Proteans, the chaotic neutral slotty replacements for Pathfinder because Pathfinder can't use slotty. And to be honest, at this point, I like Proteans more because slotty kind of got tacked on as the chaotic neutral exemplars in Dungeons and Dragons kind of haphazardly after the fact, and they were beautifully rationalized in some of the 2nd ed material, but they never quite fit as if they were done for that role from the starting point. Proteans got to be the chaotic neutral monsters from the start, and we've gotten to elaborate them from there since I made them way back when, like 2004-ish. So I did all the Proteans in there, and I did most of the daemons, although a few of them got tinkered with by other people developmentally. But most of them I came up with in Book of the Damned 3, Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And then I did all of the 4 Horsemen themselves.
That was a really cool idea to use that, the 4 Horsemen. Some of them are really awesome.
I will say, although I created the 4 Horsemen, I didn't come up with the initial concept of using the 4 Horsemen as the generic leaders of Pathfinder's daemons or daemons as embodying the concepts of mortal death. That notion was there when the cosmology was kind of handed to me by the guys at Paizo. Guys, generically speaking.
We're just about out of time. Is there anything else you wanted to say or talk about real quick before we wrap it up?
I have no idea whether Wizards of the Coast has any desires or plans to do a Planescape setting, but if they do, I don't care the fact that I'm in pharmacy school right now. I will write that. I would sell one of my kidneys on the black market to get in on writing that book. So, Wizards of the Coast, please, please, please let me write something involving Planescape. I don't care what I have to do. Please let me, because that is my bread and butter. I love it more than any other setting.
They have been pretty much hinting extremely strongly that that's the next
Yeah.
thing, you know. I mean, they're coming out with
Very
the
likely.
Mordenkai's Tome of Foes, which has
Yeah.
some Shemeshkas in it, apparently. And
Mhm.
then I guess the new adventure's out in the fall. I don't even know. But that's then the hint is it's going to
Yeah.
be Planescape is the next thing. I don't know that.
I keep abreast of anything planar in 5th Ed, even if I'm not
Mhm.
actively running something or have time to run it right now.
Mhm.
And to be honest, with my time constraints being in school, I'm still focusing almost exclusively on Pathfinder. But let's just say I would find time to write
All right.
something for
So
Planescape.
if they came out with whatever, you're allowed to use Planescape, then would you make DM's Guild stuff with Planescape stuff in it?
I would consider it, but the fact remains they're taking a 50% cut
Mm-hmm.
of your profits,
Mm-hmm.
and not just your profits, just what you get in.
Mm-hmm.
So gross, and then you don't really have any control over it thereafter. It doesn't actually get printed in a real book, and it wouldn't be considered canonical for the material afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And having done some canonical stuff in, Dragon and Dungeon magazine, quite a bit of articles that have since, gone down as canonical. I would hate to use really good ideas knowing they would never get used in any official capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if they wanted me to write for it, I would gladly do it. I would love to do it. Unfortunately, they are very hard people to contact. To say, I've written for you before, keep me in mind. Because everybody I ever knew who worked there no longer works there.
Oh. Well, I know.
And again, Pathfinder has kept me busy with stuff.
Yeah. Hey, all right, wait, there's something I want to ask. Pathfinder, they put out Starfinder. I was kind of thinking, Pathfinder's put out everything there is to put out, right? I mean, is Pathfinder, what are they going to do? It
There
seems
is
like they're at the end of their...
lot.
Yeah?
Given that they just came out or will be coming out with a planar supplement in May, trust me, they've got ideas planned out multiple years in advance. Yeah, eventually they'll come out with a second ed Pathfinder, and I think whenever that happens, I think you'll probably see that some of the stuff used in Starfinder is kind of vaguely playtesting for what might eventually go into a Pathfinder 2.0. I have absolutely no advanced knowledge of any of that. So don't anybody go spreading rumors that Todd Stewart said they're coming out with a Pathfinder 2.0. I have absolutely no knowledge of that, and frankly, I would not expect it for a number of years still.
The warning sign for me...
they've said, we will make it when our players ask for it. And at this point, I haven't seen a critical threshold of enough people asking for that. And they'll probably also do it when sales are such that they need to come out with a second edition. And to my understanding, they're still selling like hotcakes.
Really?
Starfinder utterly blew away their expectations. I mean, they've had to hire more people. They haven't publicly announced new hires, but they've added like 3 new developers.
Oh.
I glanced over at their contact list and I was like, oh, these 3 people whose names I don't recognize, except for one of them who, previously worked for WotC, are now developers. Okay, that's kind of cool. Also, because there's just such an amount of material with 2 product lines, Pathfinder and Starfinder, going on, I can only imagine the workload for some of the people prior to adding more folks on staff. But they're a great group of folks. They're all incredibly talented. I've loved working with them.
James Jacobs, I love that guy.
James Jacobs is a crazy barrel of amazing ideas.
I mean, the Demonomicon of Igwilv articles in 3rd, right? Those are like the best things.
Deep respect.
Amazing. And the way he comes up with these funny little phrases. And it's just like, where did you come up with that? You know? And he does it like it's nothing. You know what I mean?
What's fun to look at, anything that James has done, is if you look at early material, you will see foreshadowing of stuff that happens 6 years later.
Really? Oh.
And I deeply appreciate that because I do the exact same thing. I will drop hints across, 5 different books, hinting at something that may or may not eventually, get, further expanded. But at the very least, if you're paying attention as a DM, you may put puzzle pieces together and decide to use them.
Okay, everybody, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and thank you very much, Mr. Todd Stewart, for doing this. I've wanted
absolutely. It's been great. Thanks for having me on.
I've wanted to pick your brain for like forever, so it's like
absolutely
the chance to do that because you know more about Shemeshka and Planescape than probably anybody. I don't think there's. We're out of time. All right, so thanks everybody. We'll see you next time. I think next week I'm going to be talking to Will Doyle, one of the writers of Tomb of Annihilation. So I can't wait to. And he also did the 4th edition Stygian Mask adventure that I like a lot. So thanks everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks again, Todd.